Well, happy Father's Day to all those fathers out there. So today we're doing episode 42. We're gonna talk about a little bit in 2 Nephi 11:80, and then we'll talk some about the Native Americans. I got some interesting stuff I found I wanted to share. So we're back into the text again, and so it says, "But behold, I prophesy unto you." This is of course Nephi. He is prophesying of the future of his people. "I prophesy unto you concerning the last days, concerning the days when the Lord God shall bring these things forth," meaning the words of the book, "bring these things forth unto the children of men. After that, my seed and the seed of my brethren shall have dwindled in unbelief." So the Nephites and the Lamanites will have all dwindled in unbelief, "and shall have been smitten by the Gentiles." And so this prophecy is talking about this day when there's no more Lamanites and Nephites. The ites are gone because they've been swept off the land and smitten by the hand of the Gentiles. And we're in that period now where that sweeping off has occurred. And so I wanted to give a little bit of interesting history regarding the Native Americans. So this is something I didn't realize, but our forefathers all believed, most believed, that the Native Americans were of Hebrew or of Israelite descent. It was a common understanding. I just assumed it happened because the Book of Mormon came forth, and we know about it because of the Book of Mormon. But if you do some research, you'll find that it's actually was common knowledge, and I'll show you what I mean. So in 1650, a man by the name of Menashe ben Israel, he was the chief Jewish rabbi of Amsterdam. He wrote a book called The Hope of Israel, and he was talking about the Native Americans in America being a tribe of Israel, or being one of the lost tribes of Israel. 1651, Thomas Thorogood wrote a book called The Jews in America. I mean, this is 1600s. I mean, way before we're even a nation, right? 1683, William Penn, who was a Quaker, and he was the founder of Pennsylvania, he wrote this. He said, "Their language is lofty yet narrow," and he's talking about how they were just beginning to communicate with the Native Americans and all that. And so he says, "Their language is lofty yet narrow, but like the Hebrew, in signification full, like shorthand in writing. One word serveth in place of three, and the rest are supplied by the understanding of the hearer. Imperfect in their tenses, wanting in their moods, participles, adverbs, conjunctions, interjections. I have made it my business to understand it, that I might not want an interpreter on any occasion. And I must say that I know not a language spoken in Europe that hath words of more sweetness or greatness in accent and emphasis than theirs." Then 1690, Cotton Mather was an English Puritan minister. He wrote on this as well. And then 1775, we're talking almost 100 years later, James Adair wrote a book called The History of the Native Americans. And it's really hard to read. It's free online. You can Google it. You can pull it up and read it. But all the S's are replaced with F's because it's Old English. It's really hard to read, but I started reading it. It's really fascinating, and I'll talk about him in a little bit. And then 1799, Abiel Tabbitt, he was a pastor in Massachusetts. He said, "Anyone conversant with the European Jews and the Aborigines of America will perceive a great likeness in color, features, hair, aptness to cunning, dispositions for roving, etc." And he was talking about compared to the Jews. Thomas Jefferson, we all know his name, 1803, said, "All the Indians of America are descended from the Jews. The same laws, usages, rites, and ceremonies, the same sacrifices, priests, prophets, fasts, and festivals, almost the same religion, and that they all spoke some Hebrew." Now, has anybody ever heard that quote from Thomas Jefferson? And we'll get into why here in a little bit. In 1823, Ethan Smith wrote a book called The View of the Hebrews. Now, we probably have, if you've done any church history study, I know Bill's heard of this book. when the Book of Mormon came out, a lot of people accused Joseph Smith of having used this book to write the Book of Mormon. And so I've always kind of avoided it, like, oh, well, it's just, I've just kind of ignored it. Well, I started reading it, and it's actually fascinating. In my mind, it supports the Book of Mormon, not as the source of the Book of Mormon, but it's a confirmation of what's in the Book of Mormon. He talks about a whole lot of stuff that you do find in the Book of Mormon, but there's no Hebrew poetry. There's nothing that you find in the Book of Mormon and the Book of Mormon is way bigger, but it is a really interesting book. This idea is not original. I just assumed that when the Book of Mormon came out that, it was the first time anybody thought of that idea. And actually, it's been around for a long time, since 1650. So it had almost been around for almost 200 years when the Book of Mormon came forward. And so look, I want to back up to James Adair. He wrote that book in 1775 that I want to give a little background on him. So he migrated from Ireland in 1735. He was a fur trader. And he lived in North America for about 40 years, and he was cut off from Europe most of that time. He spent all of his time with the Native Americans because he was hunting. He was on their land, and he was trading with them and all that. He lived among the Chickasaw Indians from 1744 to 1751. Then he moved to South Carolina in 1751. In the 1760s, he led a group of Chickasaw warriors in war against the French. And then, so after all these experiences living among the Native Americans, he spoke their language, he was in their culture, he heard all their stories, he writes this book. And so he put all his stuff from his journals and his notes together and wrote this book in 1775. He was convinced that the Native Americans were descendants of the Hebrews, of the house of Israel, one of the lost tribes. And then he wrote this is out of his book, said, "From the most accurate observations I could make, in the long time I traded among the Indians of America, I was forced to believe them lineally descended from the tribes of Israel." And it was because he saw so many things in their culture and their heritage. And so in his book, he outlines 23 different reasons why he believes that the Native Americans are descendants of the Hebrews. So one, they believe in a single God. Many of the tribes worshipped a single. Now, this wasn't true for every single tribe in every single instance, but these are things he encountered in his travels. So he said some of the tribes worshipped a single God, just like Hebrew monotheism. And interesting enough, their name, the Indian name for God, was Jehovah, like Jehovah. It's even written even the same way, a very similar sound even for the name of God. Tribal organization, the native tribes had governance structures similar to the Israelite tribes, like with the judges and all that. The purification rituals, they had these cleansing practices before they did any kind of religious stuff. They had sacred feasts. Some of them even actually had 7 feasts, which is how many there are in for the Jews. They had marriage customs very similar. The rules around marriage and family were similar to the biblical traditions. Their tabernacle, they had these tabernacles that were like a tabernacle structure where it was like a sacred space, a safe space to worship. They had circumcision-like practices. Some of the tribes had initiated rites that resembled circumcision. They had sacrificial offerings in some of the similar ways that Israel performed their sacrifice. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about the Lamanites here, who over time, dwindled in unbelief. So obviously, it's not exactly the way it was in the Bible, because these are people that have fallen away from God and forgotten Christ. But there are little pieces that are left from the past. So they had priestly roles. They had certain tribal leaders function like a Hebrew priest. They had laws of clean and unclean. Like, one of the things, they avoided pork, considered it an unclean meat. They had Hebrew-like words. Adair noticed that they had very similar linguistic similarities between some of the languages. Like, for example, the word Abba means father in Hebrew, but it also meant father in the Indian language. Same word, Abba. And then it's Yohevah is what they would say for Jehovah or God, and pretty similar. They had similar burial customs. The funeral rites were a lot like the Israelite traditions. They had fasting practices. They did oaths and covenants, much like the oaths in the Bible. They had cities of refuge where they could go and escape and be kept safe, just like in Israel. They had symbolic numbers. They used the number 7 and 12 all the time in their stuff. They had sacred fire. They used fire in their religious ceremonies. They had prophetic figures. Some of the tribes had individuals who acted like prophets or seers. They had oral traditions. They had these storytelling methods where they would pass it along, similar to the Hebrew oral traditions. They had shofar-like instruments. Certain tribes used horns in their ceremonies. In any one of these things, you say, oh, just because they use a horn doesn't mean they're Hebrew, right? It's just a horn. But when you add them all together, there's a whole lot of things that mirror the Hebrew society. They observed seasons. They knew about equinoxes, stuff like that. Some of the things they've built were facing certain directions and based on equinoxes. They believed in blood atonement, that blood sacrifice was necessary. And then they had messianic expectations. Some of the tribes, they looked for someday there'd be a great deliverer come and redeem them or save them. And so because of all that, this James Adair believed that they were direct descendants. Of course, he was in 1775, so he didn't have access to the Book of Mormon, but he believed that they were direct descendants. These are some of the words that you find in the in the Indian languages. Yehovah is Jehovah, and these mean the same thing. So Ale and Ale, same word in both, means God. And you can go down the list. Abba is the same exact word. Ish means man. Awe or Ewa is the Hebrew and Indian, means the same thing, means wife. And all these all parallel. And to have one or two words that sound alike that mean the same thing is, could be by chance, but to have this many and have no tie-in is about impossible. And so another group of the Indians that are interesting is the Micmac. So the Micmac were a tribe, they were up in the north, like in Canada. And so Micmac, the word actually means something hidden. And so the tribe was located north of where Hill Cumorah is in New York, further up north, across the border into Canada. And so when they tested their DNA, they have a really high concentration of Middle Eastern DNA, like 25% Middle Eastern DNA. They have a Hebrew custom of a 1-year betrothal and a dowry, which just like the Hebrews did. They have a belief in their oral customs of a great flood. They believe that they descended from one man and one woman. They believe that their people sailed there across the ocean. They believe that a man visited them in their past and performed a bunch of miracles, and that all the people were healed of their sicknesses by this one man. The man stayed for multiple weeks teaching and healing the people, and then he left. The man came after a period of extreme devastation and destruction, followed by 3 days of sleep or darkness, right? And I assume you all can see the parallels, right? The language contained many Hebrew words and characteristics. And I'll go over that in just a second, but the Micmac language has a whole lot of Hebrew type stuff in it. There was a French Catholic missionary named Father Christian Leclerc in 1691, and he said, these people had received in times past a knowledge of the gospel and of Christianity, which they have finally lost through the negligence and licentiousness of their ancestors. So as he's teaching them about God, they already know a lot of things. They're like, well, how do you know that? They know about the flood. They know about Adam and Eve. They know about Jesus coming, or this healer that came. And all these stories parallel, so much so that this Catholic missionary says, well, they had to have known about Christ at some point but they lost it over time. And so here's some interesting things. So this is ancient Egyptian, and this is the Mi'kmaq language. The word for good, the word for holy, and these symbols parallel, and they're similar meanings as well. And then you compare it. These are the characters taken off of the the transcript. The what'd you call it? When they wrote the Anton transcript. So they compare these characters compare to the Mi'kmaq language as well. They're not all exact, but very, very similar. And so the theory is, and this is just all theory, the theory is that the Mi'kmaq may have been some leftover Nephites because they fled to the north. And so if you read about Haggath, okay, and I'll go over this chart in a second. So if you read in this is in Alma 30, 5 through 7. It says, "And it came to pass that in the 37th year of the reign of the judges, there was a large company of men, even to the amount of 5,400 men, with their wives and their children." So you think about that, 5,000 men and their wives and their children. We're talking 15,000 people, a big group of people, maybe more. Departed out of the land of Zarahemla into the land which was northward. So these are Nephites, that they went northward, right? And it says, "And it came to pass that Haggath, he being an exceeding curious man, therefore he went forth and built him an exceeding large ship on the borders of the land bountiful by the land desolation, and launched it forth into the west sea by the narrow neck which led into the land northward. And behold, there were many of the Nephites which did enter therein, and did sail forth with much provisions, and also many women and children, and they took their course northward, and thus ended the 37th year." And so we have this large group of Nephites that all sailed away. And he ends up coming back and getting more later. But then we don't have any record of them after that. They just disappeared. And so the theory is that this group, these Mi'kmaqs, may be descendants of them because they carry so many things of the Hebrew culture. And so this is just a chart. And again, this is just a proposed theory. So you got Jacob, house of Israel, right? And he has two sons, Judah, the oldest, or not the oldest, but he has Judah, who became the Jews, right? And then Joseph of Egypt. So he marries an Egyptian woman named Asenath. And so then they have Ephraim and Manasseh. And then Manasseh ends up coming to Lehi, right? Because Lehi found out from the brass plates that he was a descendant of Manasseh. And so then Ishmael, if he descended, we don't know, but if he descended from Ephraim, they married, that would have intermingled Ephraim and Manasseh's seed together. And then their combinations created Lamanites and Nephites. And of course, they all, over time, they intermarried. And I mean, there's a lot of mixing going on. But if you follow the Nephites, you get the people of Zarahemla. Remember the people of, so then let's go over here. You got Judah. He had, King Zedekiah, let down that line. King Zedekiah was a descendant of Judah. He was king of the Jews of Judea, or of Judah. And then his son Mulek left, according to the Book of Mormon, left, Jerusalem and came over here. And the people of Zedekiah met up with the people of Zarahemla, and they became together, right? So you've got descendants of Judah connecting up with, descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh here in the New World, and they all just became Nephites, right? They considered themselves Nephites from that point forward. But anyway, you've got this group of Haggath, right? Of what the scripture we read. They went north, and so it very well could be that they kind of remained more pure or whatever, and they became the Mi'kmaqs over time. Yeah.
We as a people that believe in the Book of Mormon, we focus on this a lot. And the more that we get from this, the more inspired we get. Now, if I'm not a believer and I think you're crazy about all this, and you go back and you look at the history that you just presented by the people that were here before we were back in 1600s, before we were ever a nation. And you look at those reports about the customs and the language and even the artistry in their jewelry and other things that really coincide with what the Book of Mormon talks about. And actually, to get to the point I'm trying to make, sometimes we focus too much on this. What I'm saying is, in a broader scope, there are scriptures that talk about those books, the lost 10 tribes came to America. Now broaden your scope. It wasn't just Manasseh, and it wasn't just Ephraim that came here. There was a large immigration of the 10 tribes, like you can follow Dan all the way to Ireland. And from there, they had access to the sea. And there were tribes that out of Dan became Swedish, Norwegians, and others. We're talking Vikings even, that came to America and they migrated here and they lived here. And a lot of these traditions that you're talking about came with them, but we call them the lost 10 tribes. And I'll just leave this with you. There is mysteries in the Bible that we all need to look at and search out for ourselves. And this is one of those mysteries where there are scriptures that says all the tribes immigrated somewhere. Some went east, like to the Orient, and they would have intermingled with those races, came across the bridge, the ice bridge into Alaska and down through there. And others would have come by ship because the Danites, you talked about this already, had a section of land on the ocean and they were very good sailors. And part of that, the archeology shows that they made it all the way around. I can't remember the word they used back then, but Spain is what we use now in Portugal. And they had a trade route going back and forth that went more than likely all the way across the ocean to America. So, and I think you talked about that too somewhat, or at least hinted about it. So this is all really, I get excited when you talk about this stuff. The 12 tribes of Israel, now I was talking about 12, but 10 also is important. For the end times, they have a divine plan from God. And they suffered a lot, 10 tribes and the Jewish people, for their sinful ways. But to get to the blessing, sometimes you have to suffer to get that greater blessing. And Israel is at war right now with a group of people that wants to annihilate them. But there's a scripture that says he's going to protect them. So I just say all that to say this is wonderful stuff, and it's certainly inspirational to me. But you can branch this out.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's a wonderful story once you get it in your head. What is there and what the intention is of all this. Well, I'll let you get back to it. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I agree. When Jesus came to the Americas and visited those people, he told them he had other sheep to go visit. So we know he went elsewhere. We know there's lots of records in other places that haven't ever come forth. So, but we're also told in the Book of Mormon that he'll be using this group to start the ball rolling. Kind of to go into all the world. So, this is by no means the point of the class at all. In fact, I think if anything, we can see here how, even clear back as far as Joseph, you had intermixing of these tribes, and so I don't know that the DNA is the most important part. It's interesting, and it certainly you got people that say, oh, there's no DNA in the Americas from Europe or from Middle East. Well, that's not true. It's actually been found in multiple places, So I think that part, to mention that, is worthy of mention. Yeah.
The further away from the Bering Strait, when it throws over, the less you have Asian, the more you have European. That's me from what I've studied in the DNA part of it. So, Middle Europe and the Caucasus westward show up more on the East Coast than it does in the Indians on the West Coast.
Yeah, this haplogroup, it's all DNA technical stuff, but haplogroup X is the Jews or the Judah or House of Israel. And so when you trace that, you find that all through the different tribes, especially the Algonquins, the Iroquois up around the New York area. That's a real heavy. What's that?
5 civilized tribes.
Yeah. So anyway, it's interesting. But I think the message that we can take from this from a spiritual standpoint is that, if you think of it as Lamanites and Nephites, sometimes I believe among the Nephites, there were people that technically by blood would have been Lamanites. They were descendants that repented and joined up with the Nephites and would have considered themselves Nephites spiritually, even though their DNA said they were Lamanites. I think the same thing's true today. I think we have a whole world full of Lamanites and Nephites spiritually. And I think that Israel right now is in battle with Lamanites, even though they may not be the same DNA and all that, but it's spiritually speaking, good and evil. It's this constant battle that we're in. So here's just another little piece. This is kind of interesting. So how many of you have heard of the Ashkenazi Jews? It's hard to say. So they're a group of Israelites that when they were scattered, they went up into Eastern Europe. And they actually became a large population. Like the majority of the Jews in the world were Ashkenazi Jews because they grew and they prospered in Europe, in the Eastern Europe. And so this was written by this guy, Gil Atzmon, Longevity Genes Project. And he did a study on genetics and stuff. And this was interesting. He said the Ashkenazim branch from other Jews around the time of the destruction of the first temple. So by looking at the DNA, the evidence showed that they split off about the time of the Babylonian captivity. And it says they flourished until the Roman Empire, but then went through a severe bottleneck as they dispersed, reducing a population of several million to just 400 families. I mean, several million people traced down to just 400 surviving families who left northern Italy around the year 1000 for Central and eventually Eastern Europe. And so the Jews that were part of the Holocaust, a large majority of them were these Ashkenazi Jews that came from these 400 families because it bottlenecked and then they moved. And then that's the Jews of Germany and Eastern Europe were those descendants. And it's interesting, you look at them. This is an actual photograph from the 1800s. I think it's 1840 or 50. But anyway, they even, you can even see, this guy here looks like he's even Native American even. And they look very, they're obviously they're Middle Eastern, but. And so they've done some other stuff. There's also a gene study they did on illnesses and stuff. And they found that only the Ashkenazi Jews and the Native Americans of America have these two genes, the BRCA1 and the BRCA2. They're a gene mutation that occurs, and which makes them 10 times more likely than the general population to get certain diseases. And they have a higher risk of breast cancer, ovarian, prostate cancer, and pancreatic cancers. So just those people of that descent have a 10 times greater chance than the rest of the world. And the women of that group have a 72% higher chance of breast cancer, which is compared to 13% for the general population. So if you're of that descent, you have a 72% chance of getting breast cancer at some point in your life. So there's some other evidences too that are interesting. The Cherokee have an oral tradition that describes carrying sacred objects into battle. They carry these objects with them, and and it protects them, kind of like Israel carrying the ark. Um, some of the ceremonies that are involved, they involve ritual purification, like they cleanse themselves and all this before they go and do these like sacred dances and different things, like the Levitical temple practices. There's a tradition in the Choctaw that speaks of a man named Nuah, and who was warned by the Great Spirit that he was to build a boat to save his people from a great flood. And how similar is that to Noah, right? Nuah. Um, there's an Indian legend that speaks of when all the people of the earth were in one tribe, one big tribe, and they tried to build a tower to get to heaven. And then some of the early missionaries in the 1600s claimed that the Native Americans responded to Hebrew phrases such as Shema Yisrael, which means "Hear, O Israel." They would say that word, and they knew what it meant. Which, how would they know that, right? And so, so the question is, why doesn't everyone today believe that the Native Americans are descendants of the lost tribes? I mean, they thought that in the 1650s, and they thought that for almost 200 years up into the 1800s. And then all of a sudden, it just sort of disappeared. And there's a reason for that. The modern science of the 1800s covered it up. And there's all kinds of evidence for it. There was a guy named John Wesley Powell. He was the head of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institute. And he published several papers and had this belief and kind of established this doctrine of the isolationist doctrine. And that was to say that the Native Americans never had any contact with any other outside groups other than when Europeans first arrived with, like the Spanish and, the Europeans first arrived. Other than that, there'd been no contact. And they established that as a baseline. So anybody that came forth and said, "Hey, I found this Hebrew writing on my land," or there's this Hebrew writing on a wall, or there's this character looks like Moses, in a cave painting or whatever, they dismissed it immediately because said that's impossible. There was nobody here prior to Columbus and the discovery of America by the Europeans. And so everything got shut down and called fake, and they just called it a fraud. And then in 1880, he wrote an essay. And he said it was illegitimate to connect American artifacts with ancient peoples from other continents. So when the Smithsonian says that's impossible, then don't even try to bring it forward, or you're going to be the laughingstock of science. And they established that baseline, and all of the science world just went along, said, "Okay, yeah, it didn't happen. It's impossible." So when farmers are digging up their field and they find some artifact, they were immediately accused of it being a fraud. If it supported the idea that there was anybody else here before that time, it had to be a fraud. And so basically they just shut it down. They changed history. They shut down the opinions, all these quotes, many of them disappeared. It was hard to find all this stuff. And so this is probably the most egregious one. I think I've talked about this before. You guys probably recognize it. But this is the Bat Creek Stone. It was found in Tennessee. And ironically, it was the Smithsonian that excavated it. They discovered it in an excavation dig. They dug it up in 1889, and it was in a burial mound, with other, arrowheads and, Indian artifacts. They originally thought it was Cherokee. So they were excited because they thought, oh, the Cherokee had ancient writing. Oh, this is great, So they actually took it, hung it up in the museum, said, we found this ancient Cherokee writing and put it on display. And it sat there for a long time. And then in the 1960s, 80 years later, Henriette Mertz and Cyrus Gordon realized that this thing was upside down. By flipping it over, they saw perfect Paleo-Hebrew, ancient Hebrew. And these guys were experts in Hebrew writing. And so they say, hey, that's wrong, that's upside down, turn it over. And they dated it, based on the writing style and all, they dated it back to the 1st century AD, right about the time of Christ is how they said it was. And so, of course, the Smithsonian, because of that doctrine that was established, they couldn't have this Hebrew artifact in their museum. So they immediately said, oh, it's a fake, and they sold it off, and it sort of disappeared. But what it actually says when it's facing the right way is it says for the Judeans. And part of this is it's cut off. So some of it's missing. They don't know what the rest of it would have said. But it clearly says for the Judeans and then blank, blank, blank in ancient Hebrew. And ancient Hebrew wasn't able to be read until the 1900s. Hebrew was almost a dead language. And it's not the same as modern Hebrew. It looks totally different. The characters are different. But they did learn how to do it. And then they realized, oh, this is ancient Hebrew.
Which is strange because it's very commonly accepted that ancient Hebrew came from Egyptian.
Mm-hmm.
So if they find that here, I just don't see how they can argue that.
Yeah, well, we're fighting against science. Science is a religion in and of itself,
Well, I remember a story, I read it just recently, actually. Smithsonian doesn't control the Europeans. And it was like in the 1800s, farmer out filing his bill, and he hung up on something and dug it up out of the ground, and it was a horn. And the science got a hold of it over there and said, yeah, this is authentic. It dates back a long ways. It's pretty old. And however they dated it. And it was assumed, I have to qualify this, that it was a horn of the type that was used at the Battle of Jericho by Joshua. It's in a museum over there. It's in a university.
Interesting.
It reminds me of a quote that's been going around a lot in social media lately from 1984, the book.
Mm-hmm.
It says, the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final and most essential command. There it is.
Right.
But they're saying, no, what you're seeing is not yet. Don't believe what you're seeing.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of this is tied into evolution too. So, evolution theory is that each society gets better as it goes, more advanced, more technology, more smarter and all that. Well, then you've got ancient peoples who could write and had roads and knew how to measure the stars and all this kind of stuff. And when the settlers arrived, you had this savagery going on. They didn't have roads. They didn't have, written language. There were so many things they didn't have that we're claiming they had in the Book of Mormon. Well, that's impossible because evolution says we get better over time. It's just not the other way around. But yet we've got evidence today. You've got temples that have been built in Central and South America and Egypt. They have no idea how they did it. People are still guessing on how they got those, 2,500 pound ton or whatever blocks, lifted them up so high up and got them set in place so tightly cut that you couldn't even put a piece of paper in between them. Huh? Yeah, aliens. Yeah, that's our best excuse.
What I'm curious about is this, what you call it, this progression of smartness.
Yeah, the evolution.
Evolution. If that's true, how come I haven't progressed?
Right, exactly.
The biology.
Right. Well, and so the scriptures would tell us that evolution obviously is not true, and that we get better because of the Spirit of God. And when the Spirit of God withdraws because of sin, we go backwards. The Nephites were a highly advanced society with, they had roads, they had cities, they had developed culture, they had all that stuff, and they lost it because they dwindled in unbelief and they became savage. Went back to living like animals, living on the plains chasing buffalo, and so.
Like in LA.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but anyway, this idea that you could pull a stone out of the ground from, a couple thousand years ago and find ancient writing that has some Egyptian characteristics, this tied to Paleo-Hebrew, that would coincide not only with the Book of Mormon, but just coincided with the idea that Hebrew-speaking people did move in different places of the world. They can't accept that because they need to stick with their narrative, or otherwise they got to start questioning evolution. They got to start questioning, the manifest destiny. We got to make excuses for why we drove the Indians off the land. To say, oh, they're savages and they don't know any better. That was more comfortable than to say we just wiped this people out, and we brought judgment on them. And so it was another interesting point on this, and I think I'm about done here. But so the artifact was again so it got put in a museum. And I can't remember where it is right now. It's in a museum. You can see it, but it got put in a museum and then re-inspected in 1988. They put it under an electron microscope to see if it had like tool marks and trying to see if it was a fake. They couldn't find any evidence of any kind of modern equipment. And then they found some wood fragments buried within the etching because it had been buried under the ground, right? Well, the wood fragments dated back to 32 AD when they put it under the testing. So it was buried under the ground with wood that had disintegrated in 32 AD, through decomposition underground. And so everything points to it being authentic. Now that doesn't mean there aren't some fakes out there. There were some people in the 1800s that were trying to make money, and they came up with fake stuff. But this one, there's no evidence that it is, other than the fact that the Smithsonian says that it can't be real, based on their beliefs. So anyway, I just have I'll go ahead and stop there. So we'll finish a little bit of this up next week, and then we're going to talk about the Gentiles. So thanks.